Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, here's a thought, maybe a bit of a challenging one. What if trying to follow ancient texts, like the Bible, sometimes actually led to more suffering? It sounds kind of shocking, but I think for some people that feeling really hits home.
Yeah, it's a valid feeling, definitely.
Yeah.
And it really points to something we've been looking into. This long-standing misreading, maybe, of key books like Exodus and Leviticus.
Misreading how?
Well, historically, the emphasis got skewed. Way too much focus on the big temple buildings, the elaborate sacrifices, almost above everything else.
Right, and that wasn't just like a personal spiritual thing, was it? These historical consequences were actually pretty significant.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just about individual belief, not at all. When you trace it through history, this interpretation or misinterpretation, it shaped whole societies.
Wow.
Yeah, it influenced structures, people's lives, often in ways that, frankly, seem opposite to what the texts originally intended. And the thing is, Deuteronomy, which offers this different angle.
The renewal idea.
Exactly, the renewal. It emphasizes practical living, real responsibility towards your neighbors. That part often got sidelined, sort of ignored.
So it was there, this alternative view in Deuteronomy, but just missed. Okay, so that's our mission today, though. We're going to dig into these texts, try to uncover the maybe surprising original intent, and really understand how misreading them shaped history.
Yeah.
And maybe still affects us now. Let's get into it.
Sounds good.
So when you think Exodus, Leviticus,
Yeah.
what's the first image that comes to mind? For me, and probably for a lot of people, it's huge ornate tabernacles, right?
Yeah.
And lots of very serious formal sacrifices.
It's definitely the common picture, yeah. You see it everywhere in art and how people talk about it. And this is where it gets interesting, that image might be where the misunderstanding starts.
How so?
Well, the research suggests the reality was pretty different, especially the tabernacle itself.
Really?
Yeah.
Because, my mental image is definitely grand.
Turns out the actual tabernacle, surprisingly small. I mean, not even close to the scale of the massive temples in Egypt they would have known.
Small. Okay, that's unexpected.
And get this. The materials were really humble. Things like cloth that the people themselves brought. Basically, recycled or repurposed items.
Repurposed. Wow. Okay, so why? What was the point of that? It feels so counterintuitive to the idea of building something for God.
Well, think about it. They just escaped slavery in Egypt, right? Where there were forced laborers building these gigantic, showy temples for Pharaoh's gods.
Right, forced labor.
So this humble little tabernacle, built with their own simple contributed stuff, it was a deliberate lesson. It was saying our God is different. It's not about worldly status or, impressing people with gold. God's presence could be in something modest, built freely by the community.
That changes the symbolism completely. Okay, So the building was different. What about the sacrifices? I mean, I picture animals, fire, solemn rituals, everything getting burned up.
That's the standard image for sure. Everything consumed in smoke. But if you actually read the detailed instructions, it's only the inedible parts that were burned.
Only the inedible, like what?
The blood, the fat, the entrails, the stuff you wouldn't eat anyway.
Okay. So what happened to the actual meat? The edible parts?
That's the key. The rest of the meat was shared by the people who participated in what was basically a communal feast. A celebration.
A feast.
Yeah. Think about it. In those times, meat was probably pretty scarce for most people. So this sacrifice wasn't just a solemn duty. It was a special occasion. A chance for everyone to share, to eat well together, to experience community. The sharing was the point, really.
Communal sharing. And that makes the whole thing feel so much more human, less rigid. So, okay, if that's the case with sacrifices, what about all those really complex rules for the priests in Leviticus? They always seem to me to be about emphasizing extreme holiness.
Yeah.
Keeping everything just so.
Well, holiness was definitely part of it, yes. But there's another layer, a really fascinating interpretation that suggests these rules were primarily about something else. Safety. Safety mechanisms, specifically to prevent the abuse of power by the priests themselves.
Okay. How did that work?
The very detailed rules about who could do what, when, how, They weren't just random. They seemed designed to stop specific individuals or families from basically cornering the market on sacrifices, or maybe even controlling access to God through manipulating divine oracles.
So like stopping corruption before it starts, making sure no one priest or family got too powerful.
Exactly. Like an early form of checks and balances within the religious system. We even see hints in the historical books, like remember stories about priests maybe tweaking prophecies during King David's time? These rules were meant to guard against that kind of thing.
Were they effective, though? I mean, did it work?
Well, like any system, probably not perfectly. But here's the truly astonishing part the texts mention. These regulations weren't secret priestly knowledge. They were taught to everyone.
Everyone. Even regular folks. Kids.
Yes, even children. The idea was to empower the public, the community, to actually monitor the clergy. So people knew the rules. They could tell if something wasn't right. There were even sayings, apparently, like, if you fall asleep reading Leviticus, you might get religiously ripped off.
Serious, huh?
Basically, yeah. It was a warning. Pay attention, understand these rules, because it protects you from being manipulated by those in religious authority.
That is. Wow. That's profound. It wasn't just about ritual purity then. It was about transparency, accountability, empowering the community itself.
That really seems to be the core idea, yes. Community, sharing, preventing power abuse, much more grounded and practical than just grand buildings and rigid rituals.
Okay, so if that was the original intent, the spirit of Exodus and Leviticus, how did things get so off track? How did we end up with interpretations that, like we said at the start, sometimes seem to cause more problems?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And that's where Deuteronomy comes back in. The problem, as the research suggests, is that the message of Deuteronomy, this renewal, was largely ignored or maybe even actively rejected over time.
Right. You mentioned it wasn't just a repeat of the earlier laws.
Not at all. It was framed as a fundamental reset, a renewal of the core message. And a huge part of that renewal was a shift in focus.
A shift away from?
Away from specific places, like the tabernacle, or specific ritual acts, like the details of sacrifice. The emphasis moved dramatically towards listening to God's word. You know, the Shema, hear, O Israel.
The central prayer.
Right. Listening, and then, crucially, living it out, putting it into practice in everyday life.
Okay, living it out how? What did that look like in Deuteronomy?
Well, the absolute central thing, the most important task of faith, according to Deuteronomy, became dealing with the problems of the vulnerable in society.
The vulnerable.
Yeah.
So the poor.
The poor, orphans, widows, foreigners, anyone who was socially or economically marginalized. Caring for them wasn't just a nice suggestion. It was presented as the main job of a faithful person.
That's a powerful emphasis. Was it just like abstract teaching, or were there practical ways this played out?
Oh, very practical. Look at the festivals again. They weren't just holidays to remember the past. They were designed as living educational experiences.
How so? Like the unleavened bread you mentioned.
Exactly. Eating that simple, rough bread for a week wasn't just symbolic. It was meant to be a physical act, to actually help people feel, even in a small way, the hardship of the poor, to build gut-level empathy.
That's a really embodied way of learning.
It really is. And then there's the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths. People were told to live in temporary shelters, like little huts, for a whole week.
Why?
To physically experience, again, just for a short time, what it felt like to be insecure, maybe homeless, like their ancestors were in the desert, or like foreigners might be in their own land. It fosters that sense of empathy and responsibility.
So these weren't just parties. They were deep social lessons.
Deep social and ethical lessons. And the climax of these festivals, it's amazing. On the final day, the instruction was to prepare the best food, a real feast.
For everyone to enjoy.
For the poor and the marginalized specifically. They were the guests of honor. They would eat their fill, and the worshipers themselves, the hosts, were supposed to serve them.
Well, the worshipers serve the poor. That completely flips the usual dynamic.
It really does. And think about tithes and offerings, too. The usual picture is everything goes to the central temple, right?
Yeah, collected centrally.
But Deuteronomy describes something different. It talks about tithes and offerings being collected and used locally at what you might call local community centers or sanctuaries.
Locally? For what?
Part of it supported the Levites, the priestly group who didn't own land. But a major function was essentially a local social welfare fund.
A welfare fund.
Yeah, to directly help neighbors in that community who maybe had no land or whose crops failed that year. It addressed real, immediate needs right there where people lived.
That is radically different. It's decentralized, community-focused, practical aid. Not about building a big central institution, but about neighbor, helping neighbor.
It's a total paradigm shift, isn't it? Focusing on community resilience and direct support.
Absolutely. But you said history didn't really follow this path.
Sadly, no. For the most part, both later Israelite history and then, large parts of Christian history tended to drift away from this Deuteronomic emphasis on social action.
And drifted back towards
that misinterpreted Exodus Leviticus model. The focus went back to the grand buildings, the complex rituals, the central authority.
Can you give some examples of how that played out historically? Where did this deviation lead?
Well, think about periods like the Middle Ages in Europe. You had situations where, often in the name of Christian faith, serfs were heavily exploited. Their labor used to build huge cathedrals.
Right.
Or think about the sale of indulgences, basically paying for forgiveness.
Yeah.
These kinds of things are completely at odds with the biblical message of justice, mercy, and caring for the poor found so strongly in Deuteronomy.
So faith, tragically, sometimes became a tool that actually contributed to people's suffering.
Exactly. A deep, tragic irony. And, it's not just ancient history.
How do you mean? You see echoes today.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
You still hear criticisms, don't you, about whether some churches or religious organizations maybe put too much emphasis on, say, big building projects or measuring success by attendance numbers.
Rather than on that direct social responsibility, the care for the vulnerable that Deuteronomy highlights.
Precisely. It's that potential pattern of prioritizing the visible, the institutional, over the relational, the practical help for those in need.
And that's a really serious point because it suggests that someone could think they're being faithful, following God's word. But because they're focused on the wrong model, the outcome is actually the opposite of the intended spirit.
It's like using the map upside down, as you said, which makes Jesus' example even more striking, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, think about what he quoted most often. It was frequently Deuteronomy, and his new commandment wasn't about building temples or perfecting rituals.
It was love one another.
Exactly. Love God, love your neighbor. It brings it right back to relationships, practical action, aligning perfectly with that core spirit of Deuteronomy. Not buildings, not elaborate ceremonies, but love in action.
Okay, and thinking about how this understanding, this correct understanding, is supposed to be passed on. Deuteronomy had something specific to say about education too, right? It wasn't just down to the priests.
That's another crucial, maybe overlooked point. Deuteronomy places the primary responsibility for faith education squarely on parents, in the family.
On parents, not the clergy.
Parents first. They were supposed to learn God's ways, live them out, practice them, and then diligently teach them to their children. It was partly about protecting their kids from potentially distorted teachings they might get elsewhere.
So, equipping the family to be the first line of defense against misinterpretation.
You could put it that way, yeah. The wider community, the religious leaders, their role was important too, to support and educate the parents, to help build that foundation. But it starts in the home. It's a shared responsibility, designed to keep the faith authentic and practical, rooted in family and community life, generation after generation.
It all seems to point back to this grounded, community-focused, practical approach.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, it really forces you to look back, doesn't it? To reflect on this whole historical journey of interpretation and ask, has there been this long, maybe centuries long, over-focus on the outer shell? The buildings, the rituals, the visible stuff.
Instead of the essence.
Yeah, instead of the essence.
Yeah.
Which, from what we've discussed, seems to be about genuine neighborly love, about justice, about practical care.
It certainly seems that way. The research suggests that truly living God's word, especially as Deuteronomy lays it out, means really trying to feel, to empathize with the struggles of your neighbors.
And not just feeling it, but doing something.
And taking concrete action, actually doing something to meet their real needs. Maybe that's the ultimate point. Maybe that practical love is the real completion of whatever educational purpose those original Exodus and Leviticus rituals had.
That's a powerful idea. Fulfilling the ritual by loving your neighbor in practice. Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on.
Mm-hmm.
What does genuine faith actually look like? Faith that goes beyond the impressive buildings, beyond the familiar worship forms. Mm-hmm. What does it look like in your life day to day? Especially as you try to genuinely serve the people around you, your neighbors, and address their practical, real-world needs.